Kia ora koutou. My name is Diego Navarro. I work at Victoria University of Wellington, Te Herenga Waka, for the School of Languages and Cultures. Thank you for taking time to listen to this pre-recorded presentation. I've not done a pre-recorded presentation before, so I'm very much looking forward to this new experience. And I hope it can generate some important discussion about using qualitative methods to explore conceptions of belonging across contexts. In this talk, I will begin by contextualizing the work I'm presenting. I'll mention some things about migration and migrants, specifically refugee migrants, as research participants. And I'll highlight some of the more salient challenges these individuals can face throughout the processes of integrating into a new national culture, most notably language. And then I'll explain what I mean by language learner cognition and describe how this construct as a component of the psychology of language learning can serve as a valuable lens to explore some of these challenges. After that, I'll describe how I use unstructured interviews or conversations as research methods in helping me access learner cognition, particularly in how it centers the participants and their experiences. Next, I'll provide some excerpts of data to highlight the type of accounts unstructured interviews can help generate in the form of a case study. And finally, I'll put forth some discussion points as a conclusion. Migration or settlement settings are charged sites of interpersonal contact where linguistic and cultural competencies are markedly different. And as such, they offer unique opportunities for investigating the navigation and negotiation of belonging at the individual level and at the group level. Also at a micro level, migration contexts can highlight how factors such as the role of language and the impact of age create and reflect actual and perceived boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. In other words, these settings invite nuanced ways of understanding the processes and practices behind the building of very real and very lived in-group and out-group markers. Now, while the migration process carries a host of belonging issues, it's important to note that not all migration is the same. For the approximately 20 million refugees worldwide fleeing some sort of life-threatening danger in their home country, the migration experience is markedly different from other groups of migrants. The United Nations for over 70 years has recognized refugees as a population of people who are fearful for their lives and as such are forced to physically move from their country of birth to an alternative. As such, there are various challenges associated with this type of migration and settlement. In this talk, I'll focus specifically on the challenges posed to mature adult refugees or individuals over 30 years of age. Compared to other migrants, refugees are unique in that they consistently lack formal education. In other words, a lot of them have not had the opportunity to spend a lot of time in classrooms or schools. There's no authoritative data on the educational qualifications of refugees, but Blaker and Hardman in 2001 report that 80% of adult quota refugees in New Zealand since 1995 have not completed a primary school education. Another report found that across refugee intake since 1995, 40% have no literacy skills in their own first language. And this lack of experience with formal education presents a significant problem for language learning, which is a key part of the migration process. Age also poses important issues. For adults, it'll be harder to establish social networks. A consequence of this is that exposure to the host nation's language is limited in addition to enhanced feelings of isolation, and not to mention the stress or trauma associated with this migration. It can't be taken for granted that the decision to migrate is a desperate one, born out of fear, not a decision they would have necessarily made under normal circumstances. And it cannot be taken, and what I'd like to stress here is that at the center of the migration process then is often the idea or concept of choice. Refugees don't have a choice where they go. It's often leave or die. And this acts as a constraint on their migration experience, which inevitably manifests itself in different ways. So with some understanding of resettlement as it relates to refugees, we can now better imagine how these individuals immigrating to a country that they tend to know very little about may carry ambivalent or undeveloped attitudes and beliefs toward the country, including opinions about its language, or the languages, and this will inevitably impact their navigation of inclusion and exclusion. In fact, recently arrived refugees, the refugees I worked with were between 6 months of arrival to the host country and 1 year, a great deal of the attitudes and emotions that they develop toward the host culture and including its language are largely shaped by their day-to-day experiences with different ways of doing things, including a different language, which leads to my next point about the development of a language learner's cognition. Language learner cognition, is a component of the psychology of language learning, which rooted in educational psychology, focus specifically on things like motivation, attitudes, those subsects of an individual's psychology. The term that I adopt to help identify the different psychological subsects, as I said, at work with language learners, as they relate to any and all aspects of learning an additional language. So Devin Woods in the late 90s conducted what he termed a cognitive ethnographic study of language teachers' mental lives. And in his longitudinal project, which centered participants' understanding of events in context, he suggests that rather than asking explicitly about beliefs or attitudes, which is what a lot of questionnaires and interviews do, it's important to explore personal accounts and anecdotes of practice or experience. And these accounts told over time, particular themes will emerge from these discussions or conversations, which can be considered representations of an individual's cognition. In other words, we can make sense of an individual's cognition over time through a type of guided introspection and reflection. So in order to make sense of how a language learner's cognition, again, their attitudes, beliefs, and emotions that language learners form, and to help me explore this often undeveloped and kind of nascent dimension of language learning, I turned to a particular methodology. So to explore cognition in particular these nascent, undeveloped, often unrecognized beliefs and emotions, I adopted ethnographic methods, which purposely center the participants' voices and experiences. I wanted to investigate how my participants' interpretations of what is happening around them can offer insight into their cognition, and how this developing cognition itself interplays with their behavior, including their capacity and interest in integrating into the host culture or country. Qualitative research, it should be noted, with its inherent interest in experience, also makes central the authority of context, which I quite valued for this study. I thought it was really important to get a clear idea of the contextual nature of these interactions. Language learner cognition research, which uses qualitative ethnographic interviews to centralize learners' voice, is effective throughout research in highlighting the subjective nature of the L2 learning process, or the process of learning a second or additional language. In other words, by focusing on a learner's descriptions and evaluations of contextual second language related activity, interviews can help demonstrate just how personal and, I guess, variable learning an additional language can be. Moreover, the centralization of learners' voices means that the research becomes as much an activity for the participants as it is about them. That was something I was very keen to explore. And mirroring moves in other L2 related qualitative studies toward more emancipating research, language learner cognition research, which carries the learner experience at its center, at its core, stresses the need to not only involve, but also empower participants. In the related field of narrative inquiry, for example, which makes extensive use of qualitative interviewing for the production of oral narratives, an explicit goal is to broaden the breadth of voices heard in research. So to get more people's voices heard, to get more people recognized, get them out of the periphery and into the center, highlighting the experience of marginalized groups outside of the academy. A necessary goal of any empowerment movement is working to ensure that the voices of people which are not traditionally part of society's dominant discourses get heard. So now I'd like to take you through a specific example of the kind of findings this methodology helped me put together. As I mentioned, the design I used for the study brought in elements of ethnographic and narrative research. For 16 months, I immersed myself in the lives of 5 recently arrived Colombian adult refugees and 1 migrant. 3 of the 5 refugees were single mothers. I used unstructured or in-depth interviews or conversations. This is particularly important because these talks, this way of gathering data, promoted and stimulated reflection as a consequence of their structure. And it was largely through this reflection that the participants were given opportunities to interpret and analyze, I guess, their own L2 related experiences. And in other words, in talking to me about their day-to-day interactions in English, the participants were able to construct and develop a cognition, which consequently guided how they behaved in and interpreted new second language related experiences. This happened for months. It was all in Spanish, which is the participants' first language. And in this talk, I'm just going to focus on 1 participant, just to show you how these methods, well, particularly this method, these in-depth conversations, were able to emerge this learner's cognition and how it related to her experiences of including herself in this new context, new culture, but also excluding herself. Constanza, from the very beginning, makes it clear that she has a strong affinity for foreign languages with a particular affection for English. As long as she can remember, she says she's been dreaming about a life which incorporates the use of foreign languages. She was an au pair with a Dutch couple. She worked in Chinese restaurants, and she loved to daydream about what they were talking about when she was in these restaurants. She would hear the customers come in, and she loved daydreaming. She always thought of herself that if she always told herself that if she had this opportunity or this chance, when she grew up, she wanted to be, learn foreign languages. She explained how other people might want to grow up and they want to be doctors or pilots. And she said this very clearly, that she wanted to explore or work with some capacity with foreign languages, which would have been English in her case, which is what she really wanted. And so in many ways, she felt that moving to New Zealand was like a dream come true for her. It sounds a little dramatic maybe, but it's how she put it. This is an excerpt when she talked about it. It was one of her childhood dreams that when she got older, I'd like to study English at university. Interviews with Constanza were more, as I said, with all my participants, were like very, very lengthy, very personal, very introspective conversations. And they became an opportunity for her to explore her perceived lack of progress in English. She makes it clear to me that she is struggling to understand English and to make herself understood. Throughout the project, she presents numerous tales of her being made to feel defenseless or ashamed, getting hung up on the phone, running out of buildings and offices in tears, and her lack of progress was actually quite palpable. She does have very, very low English proficiency, and each time we met, she offered numerous reasons and theories for her issues, or lack of time, fatigue, lack of interest, lack of opportunity to practice. She was also one of my most isolated participants. She doesn't have many friends outside of one or two acquaintances in the Colombian community, and spends most of her time at home, occasionally goes to church or picnics. But she uses these interactions to unpack what the problems are with her and the development of her English. Eventually, a theme begins to emerge after we work together for a while, where she mentions in her first couple of meetings referring to a particular sound, something to do with the sound of a particular spoken English, letting me know that she evaluates how the language sounds either as good or bad. She's got this evaluative, I guess, frame and an idea, very strong belief about how a language should sound, as good or bad or proper or improper. And she doesn't like the way English sounds, some English sounds. And she begins to communicate these beliefs associated with the sounds of English carrying a strong emotional charge. And she doesn't like, for example, the way the electronic translator sounds. When she was trying to use a translator, she says it's sounded very, very strange. She also refers to it as ugly. She doesn't like that. She also refers to her classmates. She doesn't like speaking with them because she doesn't like their English sound. She says it's really ugly too, and she doesn't like the way they pronounce English. So Constanza in her accounts, and these are just excerpts, but in lots of her accounts of everyday interactions and communicating, these subjective, evaluative critiques of which relate explicitly to how English sounds or is meant to sound. She's got a very clear idea, or she's developing a very clear idea of what she thinks they need to sound like. And at the same time, it's interesting, another issue begins to emerge around intelligibility. Constanza begins to communicate this issue. She can't make herself understood, she says, even when using the correct language, and she cannot, even if she has the right word, and she's prepared for these, she's got the statements ready to go when she'd go out and speak to people. She would write down what she would say. It posed a real problem for her. She's laughed at by her family and corrected. She's ignored across different social settings. There are a significant number of accounts of her interactions breaking down a result of intelligibility. Her day-to-day interactions become significantly problematic. It really frustrates her that she knows, she says this, she knows the words, what they are, but she can't produce them properly or make sense of them when they're spoken. So for example, She recalls an incident where she was praying for groceries and the cashier asking her for something, but struggling to understand, having no idea what's being asked. Instead, her youngest son had to translate for her, which was quite common, using her children as translators or going to the store to look for mirrors, knowing that she had to ask for mirrors, knowing and practicing the word, and failing to communicate to the shop staff her desire to find mirrors. In another account of her working at home with her tutor and failing to understand easy English, her home language tutor being one of the few people she speaks with in the face of face-to-face situations on a regular basis. She explains her frustration in not being able to make sense of what she was saying when referring to an apple. This particular interaction presented a significant issue for Constanza, and she mentions increasingly a problem of not being able to understand the Kiwi tutor because they speak differently. Constanza now begins, over time, after a few months, to communicate an issue with New Zealand's way of speaking English, and she presents a negative evaluation toward New Zealand English. We can see over time her problem with the New Zealand variety of English begins to be used as a rationale for her inability to make progress with the language or additional language. Constanza is evaluating this variety of English as more challenging than others. She states that she can't make sense of what's being spoken to her because people here eat their words, while she finds the North American English much clearer. In other words, Constanza asserts an explicit preference noted in intelligibility for North American English. And this observation calls into question Mackenzie's 2008 claim that learners' familiarity with the variety through different exposure mediums leads to construction of favorable conceptions. Constanza has been in New Zealand long enough to become familiar with this variety, but her cognition toward it appears less than favorable. The nature of her largely unsupported interactions in English have for the most part been very negative. She cannot make herself understood, and she cannot manage to understand the English around her. As a consequence, she constructs the idea that the specific variety of language that is inhibiting her development, and this issue with how English should and shouldn't sound, persists for quite some time over the next months. Until the end of the research, where we're coming close to the end, where I note an obvious difference in the accounts of her L2 activity, her second language activity. Her retelling and reflection carries a more positive examples of her asserting herself and trying to interact in English with a relative success. And she seems obviously very happy about this. And when I ask her about it, Constanza communicates a revised view regarding her attitude to English and its different varieties. She paints it as a type of realization, an epiphany almost that she has come to, that her aversion toward the variety of English was a silly idea in her head, acting as an obstacle to her development. Her awareness of this, she calls it a tonteria, which is like a foolishness or stupidity, means that she can let go and get on with her learning. That's what she says. And she believes that this realization will now help her move toward a change in how she approaches her interactions in English. She explains how if she can move on from this belief that English sounds horrible and foolish, she too will finally be able to acquire English. And she'll be able to ask questions and offer responses, and she'll be able to establish interpersonal relationships, which is key to her, with others. And she'll be able to assert herself and begin developing and participating, both as a learner and as an adult, navigating her settlement in New Zealand society. Constanza carries throughout the project a particular affinity or affection for foreign languages, particularly toward English, but she struggles significantly every day to use and learn the language. As she searches for reasons for her issues, certain beliefs and emotions about the language emerge, are formed, and they interplay with each other, creating significant tensions, not to mention her cognition in regards to other speakers of English. The variety of English used in New Zealand and a host of others. There's a complex, dynamic system of interconnected psychological construct at work within her as a language learner, which impacts and is impacted on her by her contextualized second language activity. So a few concluding thoughts. I've presented an approach to the exploration of belonging to the dominant speech community and the national culture via investigation into a learner's what is called L2 cognition. And in regards to the methods I used, I described detailed conversation-like accounts, which provide valuable help in illuminating the different ways in which these adults, second language cognition, impact their capacity and willingness to interact and integrate in this new migrant or settlement context. As an example of how these methods can be used to better understand a learner's experiences, I presented case study of Constanza. And through the construction or reconstruction or telling or retelling of her accounts of L2 related activity, an underlying cognitive element in the form primarily of an emotive evaluation of the sound of English was emerged or was conveyed. The beliefs and emotions wrapped up around the way language should sound and her challenges in producing intelligible sounds provide a nuanced way of looking at the negotiation of belonging as it relates to settlement and personal development. I want to make the distinction here as well with this methodology between participant-centered methods and participant-led ways of doing research. This research that I conducted with these conversations are very much participant-led investigations where they bring in the topics or ideas that they want to talk about and they take them to the full extent that they want to go, and I'm there to support and listen as much as I can. Adult migrants from non-English speaking contexts in English second language settings remain largely on the periphery. A disempowered group whose key to socioeconomic and personal growth and well-being is intrinsically linked to their language learning and use. And research in New Zealand shows a correlation between the ability to use your additional language, in this case English, and employment. This also highlights the way settlement issues cannot be separated from language and power. And it's crucial that we find ways of legitimizing these individuals and their language-related experiences. And one way to do such a thing is by incorporating qualitative methods which carry at their core the experience of these participants. Thank you all very much. Have a great day and thanks for listening. Bye-bye.